celebrations is a cavalcade of 125 years of New Zealand locomotive and train design. It takes place at Christchurch Station, on the site of those first tracks that began it all so long ago. Leading the parade, one of the oldest surviving locomotives in New Zealand, Class A, one of 14 built by Dubbs & Co. of Glasgow in 1873 and 1875. In their day they were used for shunting and branch work. New Zealand Railways wrote them off by 1906, but private owners used them for many years. This one was obtained by the Plains Museum at Tynwald, 50 miles south of Christchurch, from a meat company. It's one of 3 to survive. The 2 Glasgow companies, Dubbs and Nielsen's, built 16 Class C saddle tanks at the same time as the A. C132 is owned by the Silverstream Railway in Wellington. A bigger and more useful locomotive was the D class, built between 1874 and 1888. 10 were built in New Zealand, the rest in Scotland. They weighed 17 tonnes and apparently had quite a good turn of speed. This one was used until fairly recently by the Waitaki Meat Company at Oamaru. It was given to the Pleasant Point Railway in South Canterbury for restoration. It's hauling here what was known as a birdcage passenger car. The most numerous and one of the best of the early engines was the F. 88 were built between 1872 and 1888. This one, F13, and named Peveril, was the class prototype. The F was a most capable workhorse, able to haul indecently heavy loads. The class was used all over New Zealand. 2 survive. Peveril operates at FERRYMEAD Historic Park in Christchurch. The Clerestory-style passenger car dates from the 1880s. New Zealand Railways began building its own stock quite early. In 1889, the first locomotive built by New Zealand Railways was built at Addington in Christchurch. W192 has recently been restored in the same workshop that built her so long ago. This is one of the earliest New Zealand carriages. It was originally 2 four-wheelers. One of the most significant New Zealand locomotives was the AB Class Pacific, introduced in 1915. There were 141 of them, and for about 30 years they hauled all mainline expresses, and they were equally capable with freight trains. The AB weighed 90 tonnes. 699 is operated by the Pleasant Point Railway in South Canterbury. The sole survivor of over 100 engines supplied to New Zealand by the American Baldwin Company is WD 357, built in 1901. The most important of the AB class we saw before is AB 608. She's a permanent memorial to railwaymen killed in the First World War. The first really powerful engine in New Zealand was the X-Class 482, built in 1907. They were 4-cylinder compounds built to haul 900-ton freight trains through the central North Island's mountain section. The Cavalcade has taken enthusiast groups and the Railways Corporation months to organise. Many exhibits have come from distant parts of New Zealand. It's the biggest and most varied display ever held in New Zealand. For many people here today, steam is something you see in museums. More recognisable is New Zealand Railway's DC Class Diesel Electric, a General Motors design originally introduced in the 50s, but rebuilt later with a new cab. The DC is seen every day hauling these 50-tonne coal wagons from the west coast of the South Island to Canterbury. The coal is for export. A soon-to-be phased-out diesel, the DJ class, built in the 60s in Japan and used in the South Island. One of the most successful diesels of recent years is the DF class, 1650 horsepower, built by GM in Canada, and like the DC, the engine is a two-stroke V12. New Zealand's most powerful diesel class, the DX, built in the United States by General Electric in the 70s. The class was built to speed up the congested North Island main trunk line from Auckland to Wellington. With the electrification of the main trunk, many DXs are now working in the South Island. The only electrified section in the South Island is through the Otira Tunnel in inland Canterbury. 5 EO class electrics do the work there, coupled in 3s or 4s. Back in time again to the sawmills of the early years of the century. This just restored engine was built in New Zealand by A&G Price. It works at FERRYMEAD in Christchurch. 1920s muscle, the WAB tank version of the AB class we saw before. The WAB was used on steep sections in both islands and on suburban passenger trains. The smallest locomotive in the Cavalcade, built by Fowlers in England in 1925 for the New Zealand Public Works Department for construction work. In the late 1920s, there was a need in all bigger New Zealand yards for a more powerful shunter. The C was the result. 12 were built. They worked successfully for 30 years. C864 operates at FERRYMEAD. No parade of steam would be complete without the heavy muscle of a steam crane, so much part of railway operations for 100 years or more. And no parade would be complete without New Zealand's biggest locomotive, the 146-tonne K class, introduced in 1930 for the North Island main trunk. There they hauled all trains for many years. The South Island had but 6 Ks. They ran on coal and not oil, and had a booster under the cab to raise tractive effort for the heavy work of the Midland line from Christchurch to Arthur's Pass. KB 968 awaits restoration at FERRYMEAD. New Zealand's first diesel-electric shunter was the DSC, introduced in 1959. 70 were built. They have 2 engines and are used in yards all over New Zealand. The DSC is hauling the last guards van designed for New Zealand Railways. With the abolition of freight train guards, the FM guards van is used only on passenger trains. In the 1930s, the diesel rail car arrived in New Zealand. This type was built by Vulcans in England. They worked for nearly 40 years and were popular and fast. A Vulcan holds the official New Zealand speed record of 78 miles an hour. This is New Zealand's biggest shunter. It's the DSG, built in 1980 in Japan. There are 24 DSGs. One of the truly great New Zealand locomotives, the J. Built from 1939 through the 50s, this class worked all over the country. A brilliant performer with heavy freights and express passenger trains. The first ones had streamlining as seen here, but it was removed before the J was too old. J1211 is owned by Ian Welsh of Wellington. New Zealand sawmillers owned a variety of small locomotives. This one from the west coast of the South Island is designated Class V. It's now owned by the Canterbury Steam Preservation Society. The J class we saw before was originally streamlined. After the fairings were removed to make maintenance easier, the class looked quite different. This is JA 1250. The JA was the improved J and was never streamlined. The class was the standard South Island mainline engine for 30 years. The last one was built in Dunedin in 1956, the last New Zealand designed and built steam locomotive, and a fitting finale to more than 60 years of New Zealand locomotive design. From the sublime to the almost ridiculous, the General Manager of Railways inspection car from the 1950s. New Zealand's first mainline diesel electric arrived in 1952 from English Electric. Class DE developed 660 horsepower. These locomotives have proved remarkably long-lasting. They remained in service for more than 35 years. In the same year, the railways bought 7 1,800 horsepower articulated electrics for the Wellington electrified lines, Class EW. In 1929, 6 EC electrics were bought from England for the Christchurch to Lyttelton line. But the Apis Paso Terra electrification was New Zealand's first in 1923. In 1938, 10 EDs were bought for the Wellington lines. The 1950s and 60s saw a number of diesel mechanical shunters introduced into yards around the country. All have now been withdrawn, but some, like this one, are run by private companies. The diesel-electric revolution in New Zealand got underway in the early 50s. The first big orders were from English Electric. There were 42 in the DG class. These handsome engines developed 750 horsepower and usually worked in pairs. The original livery of red with yellow whiskers suited their styling. DG 772 is preserved at FERRYMEAD. In later years, DGs were painted in the current New Zealand locomotive colours of orange and yellow. By the mid-80s, all DGs were withdrawn. These two, 770 and 791, now operate on the private Weka Pass Railway at Waipara, north of Christchurch. The carriages, steel-panelled express cars from 1930. The smallest diesel shunters operated in New Zealand, the shunting tractors, for small yards. A little larger, another of the 1950s-style diesel mechanical shunters. This one is a DSA and privately owned. It's the final exhibit in what's been the biggest collection of historical railway equipment ever seen in New Zealand. It's fitting now to end with a return to FERRYMEAD, terminus of the line that began the New Zealand railway saga 125 years ago. It's fitting too that the historic park at FERRYMEAD is dedicated to preserving for all time railway and other historical material. As the newly restored 1929 electric locomotive EC7 begins its new journey under the wires, all eyes are on the future. For FERRYMEAD and for other preserved railways, the future seems bright. But what of New Zealand railways in the harsh new age ahead? What will the second 125th celebrations be like?